We are this morning going to begin a series that we kind of started last week talking about the idea of standing fast. And that really is kind of our theme through at least the beginning part of this year. We're going to start this morning a series in the book of 1 Thessalonians. Work our way through the book of 1 Thessalonians, probably work our way through 2 Thessalonians after that. Somewhere in there is Easter, so we'll probably pause for a little bit somewhere in the middle. But I want to start this morning in the book of 1 Thessalonians, so naturally I'm going to ask you to turn to the book of Acts, because that's where it all starts, right? We need to kind of welcome ourselves, introduce ourselves to the church at Thessalonica. And so I'd like to invite you there. We have, some of us had some discussions about our church, and, every once in a while we start talking about resources or lack thereof, people or lack thereof, the spirit of the church, which is always a good thing. We have, I think, as a church, a fantastic spirit about us. We're very welcoming, very friendly, very not stuffy, sometimes too much so, very casual, very easygoing. And these are all good things, I think. But the common lament that I have is, we're like the best kept secret in town. That's not a secret I'm trying to keep, though. I don't want to be the best kept secret in town. I'd love to, for more people to know about really what we have here. And our desire as a church has always been to, grow numerically, to bring in new people. We would really love people to come to know Jesus as Savior and kind of grow up spiritually in our church. The trick of that is, of course, bring people in and keep the dynamic that we have, and I think that could be done. The question that always comes up is, what's the secret sauce? What's the secret sauce that goes from, a small church to a bigger church? And we actually find the secret sauce isn't all that secret. And we find it here in the book of Acts. And so that's where we're going to head today, is to not only introduce ourselves to the ministry, the work there in the book of in the city rather of Thessalonica, but to look a little bit at what is the secret sauce that some churches have and some churches don't. And I think that you'll see it's not so secret nor that complicated or esoteric as we go. To kind of set the stage, Paul in Acts chapter 16, I'm going to have you in Acts 17, I guess a number would help you know where to turn. But in Acts chapter 16, Paul is on his second missionary journey. Basically think in terms of, kind of a world tour or a regional tour, because he's really just, working around the Mediterranean at this point, mostly working around the Roman Empire, which for a Roman, that was the world. And so he's going off on the second missionary journey. He is accompanied by his partner, Silas, is his missionary partner. He is accompanied by his protege, Timothy. He is accompanied by his physician in Luke. And there are other people who accompany him as well as he goes along. But these are the people who travel with him quite a lot. They get to the city of Philippi, and they go out by a river where prayer is wont to be made. And what we find in the city of Philippi is that there is not a large Jewish community in the city of Philippi. And so the few Jews who are there would assemble naturally at a riverbank, someplace where they could congregate, and they could pray together, they could worship together, but they didn't have the people or the resources to have a synagogue in the city. And so Paul goes there. He is introduced to Lydia, who is a businesswoman, who is a fabric merchant, works in the mercantile field, and is a fair bit of wealth. He very rapidly finds himself arrested, and it was an economic thing. Really, he was being followed around by this little girl who was demon-possessed and kept shouting everywhere, "Hey, this is Paul. He's teaching us the words of Jesus." And after a few days of this, Paul got upset, turned around, and cast the demon out of the girl just because he was frustrated. And literally, that's how it was. He's like, enough. Just make her stop. And so he cast the demon out. The people who unfortunately owned the girl lost their profit at that point. And, wow, the amps weren't on. That's funny. Anyway, so they lost their profit. So they immediately, now with no money, are going to the town officials. They beat Paul and Silas, and they throw them in jail. Paul and Silas figure, well, as long as we're in jail anyway, and we've got this captive audience, literally, we'll just have church. And so that's what they do. They're worshiping, they're singing, they're having church. There's an earthquake. God releases them from prison. The warden of the jail there is getting ready to kill himself, because in Rome, if you lose a prisoner, you kind of lose your life. So he figured he would just expedite the whole process. It's probably faster to do it yourself. And so that's where he's going with it. And Paul says, hey, we're all still here. We're having church, free, not free, whatever. We're in the middle of the service. I'm not going anywhere. Good Baptist that he is. He's like, the service isn't over yet. We're not leaving. Chains, no chains, irrelevant. And so the jailer actually ends up getting saved. His whole house, he hears Paul's message. They all get saved. They get baptized. They get cleaned up. They go back to jail, I guess in the morning time. And the jailer finds out that the officials have decided to release them. And Paul's like, oh, wait a second. I'm a Roman citizen. You just beat me without a trial. They're not going to release me secretly. And all of a sudden, all of the town officials were, beside themselves. Because to be an uncondemned Roman without a trial or anything, your life could be forfeit. A lot of things in Rome caused your life to be forfeit. They were really fond of the death penalty. You lose a battle, you lose people. It doesn't really matter. Just like death is it's a fix-all, right? So they finally convince Paul to leave, and he leaves Philippi, and he goes through a couple other towns, and he ends up in the city of Thessalonica. It's one of the major cities in Greece. It is a city that still exists today in kind of the European western side of Turkey. Sheldonville, I believe, was the name of it. 85,000 odd people, give or take. But the place still exists today. The town, not the church so much. But and so he gets to Thessalonica, and that's where we join him in chapter 17 of Acts, beginning in verse 1. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. So we immediately find that Thessalonica has a larger Jewish population than the city of Philippi did. They have a large enough Jewish population and enough resources that they were able to build a synagogue. So they have their own place of meeting there in Thessalonica. Verse 2, then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. Now here's the secret sauce. We just read it. Did you see it? No? All right, let's back up then. We'll talk about it. The secret sauce ultimately is this, and Paul kind of used this secret sauce everywhere he went through the Roman Empire as he went. The gospel must be shared to be believed. That's the secret sauce right there. The gospel must be shared to be believed. Sharing is an absolute essential where it comes to the gospel, and it is for this reason. Jesus, let's do this true or false. Jesus was an historical person. True or false? True. The crucifixion was an historical event. True or false? True. Can you intuitively figure out historical events or people? No, you can't intuit it, right? Like you can sit under an apple tree and an apple can fall off the tree and bounce off your head and you can figure out the law of gravity. You can intuitively figure it out. You can observe it. History is one of those things that the only way you can learn anything about history is for somebody who knows it to tell you. For somebody who saw it happen to tell you, or to go back, as archaeologists do now, after the fact and kind of dig through all the records and figure it out that way. But really, you're just going back to the source documents and you're reading what the people said. When you read the newspaper from a town from 3,000 years ago, you can kind of learn a lot about the town. And so that's the value of study. But history is just one of those things that we cannot know intuitively. We cannot figure it out intuitively. You can look around here, for instance. How many of you know, or would be, maybe let's do this, how many of you would be surprised to know that here in Sheldonville, say 100 years ago, there was not one but two boat makers? How many of you knew that? Some of us did, but most of you don't. There were two boat makers here in Sheldonville. They were competitors. They were here because this little stream that you drove over on your way in was a little bit bigger, and it provided the water that they needed for milling and that kind of stuff. But you look around and you wouldn't think, hey, this looks like a boat maker's area, because one of the things that we don't have a lot of is standing water. We don't have a high demand for boats in the area. But Sheldonville, as kind of as pastoral as it is, as kind of villagey and whatever you associate with Sheldonville, you don't associate industry, and yet there actually used to be more industry in Sheldonville than there is now. But looking at it, you can't just intuitively figure that out. Somebody who knows it has to tell you in order for you to know that. So I've taught you history this morning. Sorry. But you wouldn't have known it. And Jesus is the same way. He's an historical person. The crucifixion is an historical event. The only way for anybody to know about Jesus, to know about the crucifixion, for them to connect all of the dots in the Old Testament that point to a Messiah who was going to come and who was going to sacrifice his life, the only way to connect all of those dots is to go and share the gospel. And so that's what Paul did. That's why he was in Philippi. That's why he was in Thessalonica, because the gospel must be shared to be believed. Now, sharing takes time. You notice in there as we read it that Paul reasoned with them for 3 Sabbaths, for 3 weeks. And so not only does it take a presentation of the gospel, it's more than just a declaration of fact. But you have to share how that's impacted you. You have to answer questions. You have to overcome objections. This is all part of the process. And this is where most of us, frankly, wipe out. Because the fear is, if I tell somebody about Jesus, they're going to ask me a question about the Bible that I don't know the answer to. Anybody ever had that thought? My hand is up because I have. One of the fastest ways to grow in knowledge of the Bible, and one of the fastest ways to grow in your faith, is to share the gospel, because that will happen. People will ask you questions that you don't know the answer to, and you'll have to go find the answer, or you're going to go have to ask somebody who knows the answer. Either way, the learning curve accelerates of necessity. So the very thing that we fear is the very thing that will help us grow. I fear being deemed as ignorant. Well, I mean, you think about it, how big is your Bible? Do you really expect anybody to have mastered all of it? I think it's a realistic thing if somebody asks you a question and say, I'm not really sure about the answer to that. We'll see what we can figure out. That's just part of the thing. So Paul's reasoning with them. He's answering their questions. He did have a mastery. He's overcoming their objections. That's part of the process of sharing. He's sharing what the gospel has done to him. The personal part of that is huge as well. And the other thing that we see in this is the idea that sharing has to be biblical. Notice he said he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. And so it's not just enough. Although our experience is important, it's not the end of the conversation. It might be the beginning of it. But our answers have to be biblical. We can't just make this up as we go. Again, we're talking about historical things. We're talking about doctrinal things. We have a source text that we have to draw our answers from. And really, that's where we draw our power from as well. And so Paul is not just reasoning with them, he's reasoning with them from the Scriptures. But we see in these first 3 verses, it's the secret sauce. The gospel must be shared in order to be believed. And we can see that right away that the gospel had immediate impact. Look in verse 4. And some of them were persuaded. So good news. As Paul is teaching, and you think about it, Paul's there in the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths, for 3 weeks. Do you think that's the only time or place that Paul was teaching as he's there in the city of Thessalonica? Anyone? Paul's habit was actually to just keep talking. He loved to talk. He loved to go into the marketplace. And so Paul's practice, though he would begin working in the synagogue with the Jews and the proselytes who were there, they had an understanding that who God was, and they had an understanding of the Scriptures, and so it kind of is an accelerated place to start. He would also go to the market. He would also go wherever he could find a group or an individual who would listen to him, and he would talk to them. And so for these 3 weeks, Paul is reasoning with them in the synagogue, very likely reasoning in the marketplace. Everywhere he could, there was places where people got together, discussed politics and religion, just like today. You know, if it were today, he would be in Starbucks talking to somebody, and he'd be any place he could get a couple people to listen, that's where he'd be, and that's where he was. And so for 3 weeks, he's reasoning with people in the synagogue, he's reasoning with people in the market, he's reasoning with people all over, and some of them were persuaded. Some of these people that he was talking to were like, hey, I think you're right. I do believe in Jesus. And people were getting saved is the idea here. People were becoming believers. And notice who? A great multitude, some of them being specifically in this context the Jewish men especially, and a great multitude of devout Greeks, and these are proselytes, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. And so Paul's teaching, and 3 weeks, there's Jews getting saved, there are Greeks getting saved, there are women getting saved. You're like, Jews, Greek, women, yeah, different world. You Jewish men getting saved, a lot of Greek men getting saved, and quite a few women of everything getting saved. It's just a lot of immediate response. But it wasn't the only response. If you look at the beginning of verse 5, but the Jews who were not persuaded. There were some people who rejected what Paul taught. It wasn't like Paul walked into a place and always had a 100% success rate. He's there sharing the gospel, and there are a lot of people who are believing the gospel, but there are also a lot of people who are not believing the gospel. And so there was this immediate reaction to the gospel. You get some people who are believing it, some people who aren't believing it, but either way, the gospel will produce results. When we share the gospel, people will believe it or not believe it. That's kind of the 2 options, right? You know, you say, well, there's something in the middle. Really? What's in the middle? Not much, right? You believe it, you don't believe it. Maybe you say, well, I don't believe it yet. Well, that's you don't believe it. But either way, it produces results. The gospel is one of those things that people will make a decision about. To not make a decision is to make a decision. When you hear the gospel and you're like, yeah, that's good for you, I'm glad it works for you, I'm just not ready to decide yet. No, what you just decided is no. It's like, you get up at night and you're like, I'm going to turn the light on, turn the light off. I'm not sure if I'm going to turn it on or if I'm going to leave it off. But I'm just not going to decide. What did you just do? You decided not to turn it on, right? Makes sense? There are a lot of things in life that are like that. To not make a decision is, in fact, to make a decision. And so that's true of the gospel as well. It is producing this immediate result. A lot of people are responding and believing. A lot of people are responding and not believing. And then we find that things kind of get a little turbulent here in Thessalonica because those who responded by not believing begin to stir up trouble. The gospel has to be shared to be believed. The gospel will produce response. It will produce a response, if I get all the words out. But the gospel will often be resisted as well. And that's what we find here in the last couple of verses. The Jews in verse 5 who are not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men of the marketplace and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar. Very upright, moral people. But when they did not find them, when the mob and the collected Jewish leaders couldn't find Paul and Silas, they dragged Jason and some of the brethren of the rulers of the city, crying out, "Those who have turned the world upside down have come here too." Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king. And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they, the rulers of the city, had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So good news is, Jason didn't get beat, but he did have to pay, bail to get released. It's essentially the idea here. He's like, we can arrest you, we can make things unpleasant, or you could just pay us to let you go. Bail, bribe, it's a fine line in the Roman world. It's a fine line in the American world. So we'll see. But so Jason ended up costing him money, but he didn't get beat. But you think about these Jews who didn't believe, their actual disagreement was doctrinal. They listened to Paul teach from the Scriptures, and Paul was very convincing in showing that Jesus was the Messiah that the Scriptures had prophesied about. Their disagreement was doctrinal. They disagreed. Whether they didn't see it or didn't want to see it is irrelevant. The point is, they disagreed with the way Paul interpreted the Scriptures. And so that's really their disagreement. But their driving motive was not doctrinal. It was a lot more personal, wasn't it? What was their driving motive? They became envious. Just sheer jealousy. And you think about it, and you're like, why in the world would these people be envious? Why would they be jealous of the Apostle Paul? Well, think about what we've already seen from the results. So Paul has been in Thessalonica for how long? Less than a month, right? He's only managed 3 Sabbaths. That's 3 weeks. So, give a few days on the front side, a few days on the back side. He's been there almost a month, not quite. And in that time, he has managed to make converts from within their synagogue. He has managed to make converts from around town. And in 1 month, he has had more success than they've had in the many years that they've been there themselves. One of the hopes of the Jews as they planted these synagogues throughout the world, not just so they could have a place to worship themselves, but also so they had a place where they could proselytize the people around them. There were many people, like the Greeks that we find here in the Jewish synagogue, who followed Judaism, who came to Judaism, though they were not Jewish themselves. It's a process called proselytizing. And so here's Paul. He's been here a month. These guys have been here for years. And in less than a month, he's making believers out of the synagogue. He's making believers out of the marketplace. He's got a whole big thing going already, and he's only been here a month. And they get jealous and they get envious because he's succeeding far more than they had and far more rapidly than they had. It's just basic envy, basic jealousy. It's a very personal motivation that they had. And though their resistance was personal, they presented the problem being Paul. They didn't present him as, they didn't go to the rulers of the town going, hey, we're jealous. This guy's succeeding where we failed. That's a hard line to sell, wouldn't you agree? That's not illegal to succeed, even in America still. It's not illegal to succeed. It's getting increasingly difficult, but it's not illegal. And so they didn't present the problem as this guy is succeeding where we have failed. They turned around and they presented the problem as a practical one. These guys are turning the world upside down. They're turning our culture into something different. They're changing. They presented the problem not just as practical, but one as political as well. They're saying there's another king than Caesar, and that's illegal. It's not politically correct. Funny thing about the gospel, it has never been politically correct. Rightly understood, rightly practiced, the gospel has never been politically correct. You say, what about we were a Christian nation, and we get nostalgic. 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, you could be a believer, and you could be a Christian because everybody was a Christian. No, they weren't. We think about the problem, again, problem in air quotes, that we face today. People are talking about churches are shrinking and people are leaving the churches. Yeah, that's true, but it's not Christians leaving the churches. It was the convenient people leaving the churches, the people who were there in church because it was the thing to do. It was a social thing, it was a political thing, it was a practical thing, it was a lot of motivations for going to church. When you have things that compete with it, you stop going to church. Real Christians, people who really believe the Bible, they didn't stop going to church. It's like a fish getting out of the water because, air is better. You can't. For a believer, you can't just walk away from church. Church is part of who you are. But I digress. And so the Jews, their resistance was personal, but they presented this problem to the authorities as a practical problem that these guys were teaching a way of culture that wasn't normal, and they presented it as a political problem that the gospel was not politically correct in Roman society because they dared to say that Jesus was king when everybody else said Caesar was king. I mean, goodness, Caesar had his own priests and everything. It was a religion. And this is the way they presented the problem. And so Paul, after being in Thessalonica for less than a month, finds himself in a place where time to push on. And so Jason, after he comes back from this engagement with the town officials and the people who had gathered, the brethren, I mean, very rapidly people were getting saved, and this church just literally came together out of nowhere. And after less than a month, they look at Paul and they're like, you're going to have to go. This is becoming dangerous for you. You're going to get arrested. Paul was just a very incendiary personality, and so they're like, you're just going to make the whole thing explode. It's time for you to leave town. And so Paul does. He leaves Thessalonica. He travels from there to a town called Berea. He gets to Berea, and the response was very different in Berea. In Berea, he goes to the synagogue as well, and he gets there and he begins teaching about Jesus, begins teaching from the scriptures about Messiah. And the people at Berea, and if you've ever seen a church with Berea in the name, like Berean Baptist Church or Berean Bible Church, have you seen those anywhere? The reason that pops up is because the people at Berea were fair-minded. They were willing to listen to Paul, and as Paul taught them from the scriptures, they were actually going back to the scriptures themselves to validate what he was teaching them. And when they found out, hey, this guy is actually teaching exactly what the scriptures teach, guess what happened? They were becoming believers. Paul was convincing them. News of this reached, guess where? Thessalonica. Guess how much they loved Paul? They didn't. They actually sent people from the synagogue at Thessalonica to go to Berea and start a ruckus, not within the Berean synagogue, but within the Berean political structure. They went to the Berean town officials and they're like, these rabble-rousers are here, and Paul had to leave again. Not because the people at Berea objected, but because the people who were in Thessalonica who resisted the gospel resisted to that degree that they're like, we're going to fight you tooth and nail until we get you out of here. We're going to fight you all the way to the Mediterranean or China, whichever comes first. And this is what they were doing. And so Paul goes. Paul, eventually, he himself goes to Athens, and he sends Silas and Timothy back into Berea, into Thessalonica, to try to shore up. You think about it. If you go into a town and you start a church, is a month a long time to, train leaders, teach people about Jesus, give them a good foundation of the things that you need to know and to believe? A month is really not much time at all, is it? And so Paul is doing what he can to try to shore up this church that had popped up because of his ministry there in Thessalonica. And so you get Silas, you get Timothy, and we'll see it again. He sends Timothy back a couple times. And then Paul does begin something that he's going to begin to adopt as a practice through much of his ministry. He begins writing. And when we get to the book of 1 Thessalonians, it is among the earliest, if not the earliest, of his epistles. There's some argument that Galatians may have come first, but at any rate, 1 Thessalonians is either the first or among the first of the letters he's written, because he can't be in a place, so he's going to send instruction to the place. And here he is on his second missionary journey, adopting a ministry model of necessity that has paid dividends for thousands of years, because we are able to then look at the book of 1 Thessalonians and learn from what Paul was teaching them, because he could not be there with them. So we have this fantastic book that we can look through and we can look at, and we have a sense now of the city of Thessalonica. So Paul writes a letter. It's probably about AD 51, give or take, if you're curious about the years. And a few months after 1 Thessalonians, he writes 2 Thessalonians. He sends Timothy back a couple times. On his third missionary journey, he's going to revisit the church that's there in Thessalonica, do what he can to, again, establish and shore up and teach and care for the church that's there. But the secret sauce is the important part, that first point, that the gospel must be shared to be believed. You see, the lament that we have that people aren't getting saved, that people aren't going to church, that there's so many activities on Sunday. I mean, we had families who couldn't be here today because of Sunday activities. We had families who started here but had to leave because of activities, because, our world, our culture has moved past church on Sunday. It's just not there. I mean, it used to be, but it's not. And so the lament that we have is, we live in a secular society. We live in a place where people don't know, people don't understand, people don't believe the gospel. And churches, even good churches, are a little bit smaller and seem to be struggling. The struggles that we face are really universal. Churches our size, about 50% of the churches in America today are the same size we are. 50% of the churches in America. 70 to 75% of the churches in America are 100 or fewer. So even if we were to double in size, which would be fantastic, all the way up to, like 100 people, which is really small. 75+% of the churches in America today are there. The lament that we have is that churches aren't growing and that our influence seems to be diminishing culturally. And this is true. What's the problem? Well, to be honest, we are. Because the gospel has to be shared to be believed. Are there things that we could do other than sharing the gospel that would help reach people? Yeah, maybe, but reach them how? I mean, we don't want casual people who are just here because it's, we're friendly and fun place to be. Those are the people who leave. What we want are people who are getting saved and who are coming in to learn, to grow, to be a part of us. Who, when things get difficult, They plug in more, they don't unplug. People like us. But that's where we came from. That's the secret sauce. It's not that secret. Not even that saucy. The gospel must be shared to be believed. Our culture is going to resist it. For personal reasons, for practical reasons, for political reasons. We can expect resistance. But some will believe. Some will surprise you and believe. We need to find the way to do that, to share the gospel. You say, that's hard. I know. Sorry. That's the way it is. So pray for our church. When you think about, oh, I wish we had, I wish we did, wish we could, pray for our church. Pray about that, whatever that is in your life. Wish we had more people, wish we had more money. Get in line. Pray about it. God, would you grow our church? God, would you provide for our financial needs? Because it's His church ultimately. That's why I say we get the offering. Offering is an act of worship. It's not an act of funding our needs. That's not why we give. We give because we worship. God meets our needs. But on the practical side, if more people are giving, God can meet the needs better. It's just the way it works. So pray about it. Pray for opportunities to share. Some of us are conflicted because, like you, I don't work anywhere near here. I may drive, 35 minutes to work, but people aren't going to drive 35 minutes to church. Normal people don't anyway. And so you're like, well, who do I share the gospel with? The people I work with, it's not going to help. Well, who knows? One, they might get saved, and then they might drive 35 minutes. But we shop locally. You go to the gas station locally. You go to, there are all kinds of, you go to Dunkin' Donuts locally. Goodness, the gospel runs on Dunkin' too. So pray for opportunities to share. Pray for boldness, because it's not an easy thing. I've said it many times, and I usually say it like halfway jokingly, but in our culture, it is more acceptable to tell someone to go to hell than it is to tell them they're going. Because that's confrontational. I get it. I live where you live. I face all the exact same fears that you do. I start a conversation and I go cold sweat, clammy. And if you can imagine it, I run out of words. And I'm like, what if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? It happens, even to me, especially to me. But the gospel has to be shared if it's going to be believed. Beyond that, we go into 1 Thessalonians, and Paul's going to talk about all kinds of great things. But that's the secret sauce that we need if we're going to hold fast to our faith, if we're going to stand fast in our faith. Father, we love you. We thank you for your word. Lord, I'd be the first to confess this morning that this is challenging territory for any of us. Sharing the gospel, as important as it is, certainly does not come as naturally as celebrating a football win or a baseball win or whatever our hobby might be. And yet it's more essential. Father, would you give us opportunities to share the gospel this week? And would you give us with those opportunities the boldness to actually share it? Would you help us to love people as you love them, seeing them as valued, seeing them as endangered? Father, there's so much with it. Help us, we pray, to be like Paul, to be a missionary in the world in which we live, to share it so people can hear it and receive it or reject it, but at least let them make the decision for themselves. Help us, we pray, in Jesus' good name.